March 4th, 1944, 28,000 feet above Berlin. Captain Don Gentile grips the control stick of his P-51 Mustang, eyes flicking between the horizon and the fuel gauge edging toward empty. Beneath him, the formation of B-17 bombers stretches into a silver horizon, their engines droning in unison. They have just dropped their loads over the heart of Nazi Germany, and now every man in the sky knows the cruel arithmetic of distance. Berlin is 600 miles from England. The bombers can make it home on their remaining fuel. The fighters, by every manual and engineering limit ever printed, cannot. Yet Gentile and his squadron are still here, circling above the bombers like loyal guardians. This mission should have been impossible. It had been impossible until a mechanic with grease on his hands and a stubborn streak in his soul decided impossible was a word for people who stopped thinking too soon. 6 months earlier, deep strikes like this were suicide. American bombers flying unescorted into Germany faced slaughter. October 14, 1943, Schweinfurt. 291 B-17s set out to destroy ball-bearing factories critical to the German war machine. 60 were shot down. Another 17 so damaged they never flew again. More than 600 airmen lost in a single day. The Luftwaffe had perfected the kill. Without fighter escorts, the bombers were defenseless once they crossed into German airspace. The P-47s and early P-51s turned back at the border, fuel tanks nearly dry, leaving the bombers to face waves of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs alone. The numbers were unsustainable. At this pace, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist within months. Washington demanded a solution. Engineers gathered at Wright Field and calculated until pencils snapped, but the answer never changed. Physics forbade longer range. The fighters could not carry enough fuel inside their sleek frames to go to Berlin and return. To double range, you would need double the fuel, double the weight, and an impossible shift in balance that would tear wings apart under stress. External tanks were dismissed as fantasy. Too heavy, too draggy, too dangerous. The official stance was clear: it cannot be done. On a grey November evening at Boxted Airfield, England, one Technical Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey decided he had heard the word impossible enough times. His job was maintaining aircraft, not redesigning them. Yet every day he watched bombers limp home, riddled with holes, saw pilots staring at empty bunks where friends should be. So he asked a question no manual had ever considered. What if we just hang more fuel under the wings? His superiors laughed. He ignored them. After hours, he scavenged parts from wrecks, fuel lines, bolts, sheet metal, and in a corner of the hangar began to build. The contraption he created was crude, little more than a teardrop tank welded from scrap with a release lever fashioned from repurposed control rods. But it could hold 75 gallons of aviation fuel. It could be bolted to the underside of a P-51's wing, and if it worked, it could mean an extra 90 minutes of flight time. Major James Howard found Kelsey working one night and demanded an explanation. Kelsey told him plainly, "Sir, if the tank stays on, we go farther. If it feeds right, we get home. If it blows up, well, we're already dying anyway." Howard should have stopped him, but something in the sergeant's logic felt undeniable. He ordered a test flight. Captain Jack Ilfrey drew the short straw, or maybe volunteered out of curiosity, and climbed into the Mustang with Kelsey's ungainly creation strapped under one wing. Ground crew held their breath as the plane roared down the runway. It lifted smoothly. The tank stayed on. 10,000 feet up, Ilfrey switched to the external feed. The Merlin engine purred. He banked, rolled, climbed, dived. The plane handled differently, sluggish but stable. Finally he pulled the jettison lever. The tank dropped away cleanly, spinning harmlessly toward a field below. When he landed, his report was short and calm. "It works." That report traveled faster than fuel through a pressure line. Howard immediately wired headquarters for authorization to produce more tanks. The response was bureaucratic ice. External fuel tanks were officially rejected months earlier. Testing unauthorized. Cease immediately. Howard read the order, folded it once, and handed it to Kelsey. "Build more." Within days, mechanics were welding tanks in secret, each one a little cleaner, a little more refined. They called them Kelsey's coffins, half joking, half reverent. When General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, learned of the unauthorized project, he summoned Howard for explanation. Howard did not flinch. "Sir, with respect, we're losing bombers because fighters can't stay with them. This fixes that. Every day we delay, more crews die." Eaker listened. He glanced at the fuel charts, the combat loss graphs, and then at the line reading, "Berlin, out of range." One question sealed it. "How much farther can they go?" Howard answered, "Far enough to reach Berlin." The general gave a rare, quiet order. "Then make it happen." By January 1944, North American aviation was producing Kelsey's tank in 3 sizes, 75, 108, and 150 gallons. Crews worked triple shifts. Logistics officers learned to bolt them on, fill them, and brief pilots on their quirks. The first combat test came over Frankfurt. 48 Mustangs rose from Debden, England, each carrying a pair of 108-gallon tanks. It was farther than any fighter had ever escorted bombers. Pilots were uneasy. "We're flying gasoline bombs," one muttered. But once airborne, the tanks held, the fuel flowed, and the sky opened. When they reached Frankfurt, German controllers assumed the escorts had turned back as usual. When P-51s dove out of the clouds above their interceptors, panic followed. 11 German fighters fell that day. Not one American was lost. The difference was range, and range meant freedom. That single innovation, the mechanic's impossible trick, reshaped the war's geometry. Suddenly the Luftwaffe had no sanctuary. Bombers that once dropped too soon or scattered under attack could stay steady, aim true, and unleash full loads on precise targets. Every factory hit, every fuel depot burning, every shattered bridge traced back to those crude tanks hanging under silver wings. By February, during what planners called Big Week, bombers struck aircraft plants across Germany under full escort. 3,700 fighter sorties filled the skies, almost all with external tanks. The Luftwaffe lost more planes in 5 days than in the previous 5 weeks. Pilots who once hunted bombers now found themselves hunted from takeoff to landing. Major Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's best, wrote later, "We realized the war in the air was lost not when we saw the bombers, but when we saw the fighters that no longer turned back." The real miracle was that it all began in a hangar with scrap metal, welding sparks, and a mechanic who never learned what couldn't be done. Gentile's Mustang, slicing through Berlin's flak-ridden sky, was proof that genius doesn't always wear epaulets. Sometimes it wears coveralls. February 1944. The chill over the English countryside could bite through even the thickest flight jacket. But inside the hangars of the 8th Air Force, the mood was feverish. The Frankfurt mission had proven the impossible true. Those aluminum teardrops strapped beneath Mustang wings had worked exactly as the crazy mechanic predicted. Fuel flow steady, release clean, no structural failures. The reports flooded in from every pilot. Range increased, Stability acceptable. Combat performance unaffected after jettison. The concept was no longer theory, it was now doctrine. The orders from General James Doolittle were unambiguous. Every P-51, P-47, and P-38 in the European theater would be fitted with external tanks. Every bomber mission from that day forward would have fighter escort all the way to the target and all the way home. Factories in America roared to life. North American Aviation in California, Republic Aviation in New York, and Lockheed in Burbank worked around the clock. By March, production lines were turning out 3,000 tanks a day. The design evolved rapidly. Pressed aluminum replaced welded steel, fittings standardized, jettison levers refined. The new 150-gallon version could stretch a Mustang's range beyond 600 miles. The Air Force engineers who had once dismissed the idea now scrambled to claim credit, but among the pilots the story was already legend. Kelsey's cans, they called them, with a mixture of affection and awe. A mechanic's brainstorm had given them wings twice as long. March 4th, 1944. Dawn breaking over Debden Airfield. Captain Don Gentile and 63 other Mustang pilots run their checklists. The target today is Berlin itself, the most heavily defended city in the world, the heart of Hitler's empire. 630 miles from the English coast. Gentile looks at the twin tanks beneath his wings and feels their weight like a promise. Each holds 150 gallons of high octane. Enough, the engineers say, to go there and back, barely. The mission brief is simple but brutal. Maintain cruising power until the bombers are in sight. Avoid unnecessary combat. Drop the tanks only when engaged. Every gallon matters. They lift off at 0800 hours, a silver wave rising through the mist. As they cross the North Sea, sunlight flashes off metal like shards of glass. In the cockpit, the fuel gauges drop slower than expected. The system works perfectly. Over Belgium, they rendezvous with the bomber stream, hundreds of flying fortresses climbing toward target altitude. At the German border, where the fighters usually turn back, Gentile's squadron keeps going. The bomber crews below cheer as they realize they are not alone. Over the radio, one voice crackles with disbelief. The escorts are still with us. German radar operators notice too. The first Messerschmitts scramble from airfields near Hanover, expecting easy prey. Instead, they find Mustangs diving from the sun. For the first time, the Luftwaffe fights American escorts over its own capital. Dogfights bloom across the sky like steel flowers. Gentile shoots down 2 enemy fighters before calling his men to break off. Every minute of combat burns precious fuel, but the bombers reach Berlin untouched. Explosions ripple across the city's industrial zones, factories, marshalling yards, power plants, all hammered by precision. The Luftwaffe reports call it a shock beyond comprehension. American fighters over Berlin. None of their assumptions about range or safety hold anymore. The flight home is tense. Fuel gauges hover near empty. The channel gleams ahead like salvation. Gentile lands with barely 15 gallons left. One by one the Mustangs touch down, engines sputtering but alive. Every aircraft returns, not a single pilot lost to fuel starvation. The impossible is now routine. The external tanks had not only extended range, they had doubled the striking power of the entire bombing force. For the first time in the war, no German target was safe. The Luftwaffe's response was denial at first. Hermann Göring dismissed the reports. These tanks are temporary, inefficient, vulnerable, he barked. But his own commander of fighter forces, General Adolf Galland, knew better. They drop the tanks before fighting, he said. They lose nothing in combat, and they can fight anywhere they choose. We are the hunted now German pilots found themselves burning fuel just to climb into position, while the Americans lingered overhead for hours. The kill ratios flipped overnight. In March alone, the 8th Air Force claimed more than 500 German fighters destroyed for fewer than 100 losses of their own. The once feared Luftwaffe was bleeding to death. By April 1944, production of external tanks had become an industrial triumph. Paper and resin replaced metal, reducing weight and cost. Each disposable tank cost just $18 to build, barely more than a set of tires. Yet each one brought hours of air superiority. Every mission launched from England now carried the hum of confidence. The crews no longer feared the empty sky beyond the Rhine. The escorts would be there. They always were. For Master Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey, the man who had started it all with a torch and a hunch, the recognition was quiet but sincere. He received a commendation for innovative thinking and technical excellence. He smiled when the citation was read, but went straight back to his maintenance bay afterward. To reporters he shrugged. "I just wanted our boys to have enough fuel to do their job." That job had become relentless. Between May 1944 and May 1945, American fighters flew more than 137,000 long-range missions, nearly all with external tanks. The results were devastating. German industry crumbled. Oil refineries vanished under waves of bombs. Rail lines twisted into scrap. The Luftwaffe could not recover. The human cost changed too. Before long-range escorts, bomber losses averaged 8 to 10% per mission. Afterward, they dropped to 2 or 3. That difference, 6 or 7 planes per 100, meant thousands of men came home who otherwise would not have. In a single year, tens of thousands of lives saved because one mechanic refused to stop at the word no. General Karl Spaatz would later call the external tank as decisive as any weapon in the arsenal. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, agreed from the other side of the war. "Once their fighters could escort bombers anywhere, our defenses collapsed," he wrote. "Distance no longer protected us." What began as a scrap metal experiment had shortened the war by months, maybe more. In May 1945, Captain Gentile flew his final mission over Prague. The tanks beneath his wings were standard issue now, so commonplace that nobody even mentioned them during briefings. But as he guided his Mustang home for the last time, he remembered that first flight over Berlin, the fear, the exhaustion, the tiny flicker of fuel that got them across the channel. He knew the truth every pilot now lived by: range is power, and power is survival. Gentile's Mustang touched down at Debden and rolled to a stop. The war was over. Around him, the ground crew moved with the calm of routine. Those tanks that once seemed absurd now hung beneath every wing like silent witnesses to ingenuity. From a single idea born of frustration and courage came the tool that broke the Luftwaffe and turned the tide of the air war. The war in the air had changed beyond recognition. By the summer of 1944, what had started as a desperate experiment in a drafty hangar had become the foundation of Allied dominance. Every airfield from Norfolk to Normandy was alive with activity. Mustangs gleaming in rows, ground crews refueling, bolting on fresh external tanks, and sending them skyward. The routine was practiced and efficient: fill, attach, test flow, check release. What once took a mechanic an hour now took 10 minutes. Each tank meant the difference between barely reaching the target and staying long enough to win the fight. By June, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, P-51s roamed as far as Warsaw. They escorted bombers in daylight, strafed rail lines by dusk, and tore through German supply convoys before dawn. Every raid had an unspoken ritual: drop the tanks at the edge of combat, fight light, and fly home heavy with victory. The Germans were exhausted, bleeding both machines and men. Their young pilots, some with less than 60 hours of flight training, faced veterans who had flown hundreds of missions. When the American fighters appeared high above, their presence announced the inevitability of defeat. Inside Germany, the devastation was methodical. Oil refineries at Merseburg and Leuna went up in flames. Aircraft factories in Regensburg, Augsburg, and Stuttgart lay in ruins. The bomber offensive, once on the brink of collapse after Schweinfurt, now smashed every industrial artery feeding the German war machine. Luftwaffe bases became graveyards. Burnt fuselages lined the runways, and behind it all was that simple innovation: the external fuel tank that doubled every fighter's endurance. The Air Force called it range extension equipment. Pilots called it freedom. The ability to escort bombers from takeoff to touchdown meant control of the air, and control of the air meant control of the war. German radar operators who once tracked incoming raids by the minute could no longer rely on gaps between waves. American fighters stayed overhead for hours. Even when the bombers turned home, the Mustangs lingered, hunting for anything that moved. The skies belonged to them. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's nightmare was complete. In a single month, over 18,000 German aircraft were destroyed or rendered useless. The Allies lost far fewer. The kill ratio climbed to 6-1 in favor of the Americans. That meant every Mustang pilot downed 6 German planes for each one lost. The reason was not just superior aircraft or tactics, it was stamina. When the Germans broke off to conserve fuel, the Americans pressed on. They had the endurance to chase, to climb again, to return for another pass. The hunters had become the hunted. In post-war interviews, German ace Adolf Galland spoke candidly about the shock. "The Americans were everywhere," he said. "They appeared over our factories, over our fields, even over our homes. We were out of fuel, out of pilots, out of time. When their fighters stayed above Berlin, I knew it was finished." The pride of the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been dismantled not by a new weapon, but by a mechanic's fuel tank. Back in England, Master Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey remained as unassuming as ever. He refused invitations to appear at ceremonies. When the press tried to make him a hero, he brushed it off. "It wasn't hero stuff," he said. "It was common sense. The planes ran out of gas. I figured they shouldn't." He spent the rest of the war maintaining aircraft, turning wrenches, teaching younger mechanics how to think beyond procedure. Those who worked beside him said he had one rule: if the book says no, figure out why. Then see if the book's wrong. After Germany's surrender, statistics told the scale of his achievement. Between May 1944 and May 1945, long-range fighters with external tanks flew nearly 140,000 sorties. Bomber losses dropped by more than 2/3. The strategic bombing campaign, once doomed by limited escort range, now reached full potential. Precision attacks crippled every aspect of the German war effort. The Allied advance across Europe was supported by skies clear of enemy aircraft. Ground troops marched under friendly air cover from Normandy to Berlin. The war in the air had been won long before the troops crossed the Rhine. Yet the story did not end with victory. The principles behind Kelsey's innovation became the blueprint for modern air warfare. After the war, engineers refined the concept into aerial refueling, tanker aircraft transferring fuel mid-air, effectively giving planes unlimited range. But every hose, every drogue, Every airborne tanker traced its lineage back to that first crude tank welded from scrap metal in a hangar. The lesson was immortal: extend range, extend power. In 1953, Air Force magazine interviewed Kelsey for a retrospective on wartime innovation. They asked him what gave him the confidence to challenge the experts. His answer was simple and disarming. "Nobody told me it was impossible," he said. "If they had, maybe I wouldn't have tried." That quote would later hang in flight training classrooms around the world, a quiet reminder that progress often begins with ignorance of limits. Captain Don Gentile, now a national hero, continued flying after the war. He often spoke about the strange humility of the invention that saved him. "Those tanks," he said, "they weren't glamorous. They were ugly, clunky, always leaking a little around the seams. But they gave us time." In combat, time is everything. Decades later, historians looking back on the air war agreed. The external fuel tank ranked among the top 10 innovations that decided World War II, alongside radar, the proximity fuse, and the atomic bomb. It did not explode or dazzle. It simply worked. And because it worked, thousands of men lived to see peace. Gentile's last flight from Debden before the war's end was quiet. The field was nearly empty, the hangars stripped of tension. He taxied slowly, took off, and circled once above the countryside. Below him, England's patchwork fields glowed green under the morning sun. He remembered that first mission to Berlin, the freezing cockpit, the endless stretch of enemy territory, the needle trembling on the empty mark. Back then, he had whispered to himself that he'd never see home again. Now, he was alive because one mechanic refused to stop at no. When Gentile touched down, the ground crew clapped softly. The war in Europe was over. The P-51 Mustang, with its external tanks gleaming in the sun, rolled to a stop, a monument to innovation through defiance. The legacy reached far beyond the runway. The same mindset that birthed those tanks became the foundation of post-war engineering. The idea that a single person, far from the spotlight, could see a flaw, build a fix, and change the course of history. In aviation schools, in research labs, in every place where innovation meets resistance, Kelsey's story became gospel. Even now, in museums where restored Mustangs hang under dim lights, visitors rarely notice the silver teardrop shapes beneath the wings. But those who know the story stop and stare. They understand that those humble tanks are not just artifacts. They are symbols of what happens when curiosity defies convention. If you follow this far, take a moment to think about that mechanic who built history from scrap. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more untold stories of ingenuity, courage, and the ideas that changed wars and lives. Every week we bring you the hidden innovators who dared to ask, "What if?" and whose answers reshape the world. Hit subscribe and stay inspired by the people who prove that sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that save everything. Late 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. The Luftwaffe's once proud squadrons were a shadow of their former power, grounded as often by fuel shortages as by fear of the silver fighters that now patrolled from horizon to horizon. At American bases in England, the roar of engines had become a familiar, constant heartbeat. Mechanics worked without pause, their hands moving with a rhythm born of repetition, securing tanks, checking fuel lines, and signing off each aircraft with chalk marks on polished aluminum. Each tank fitted to a Mustang wing was a small act of defiance against the old order of impossibility. The line between dream and reality was now measured in gallons. On the flight line, Master Sergeant Benjamin Kelsey watched the squadrons take off and disappear into the morning haze. He had long since stopped counting how many tanks he and his men had built. Thousands, tens of thousands. Some were metal, others pressed paper coated with resin, light enough to crumple in his hands, cheap enough to throw away after one flight. What mattered was that they worked. Kelsey still preferred to stay near the ground, a cigarette burning between his fingers as he listened to the growl of Merlin engines fading toward the east. He had no delusions of grandeur, no hunger for medals. Every time the planes returned, each one trailing the scent of burnt oil and victory, he simply nodded and went back to work. The front lines were moving faster than anyone expected. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. The German army was retreating on every front. And above them, P-51s flew as shepherds of the sky. They struck at rail yards, convoys, airfields. They destroyed fuel depots that left enemy tanks stranded and aircraft grounded. When bomber missions went out now, the escorts stretched across the map like an unbroken chain. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt, sending smaller groups of fighters to ambush the escorts, but it was no use. The Americans could stay aloft for hours, fighting when they wanted and vanishing when they pleased. The war's tempo had shifted irrevocably. The statistics were staggering. By December 1944, Allied fighters had destroyed over 8,000 German aircraft in the air and on the ground. The average Luftwaffe pilot, barely out of training, lasted only 3 missions before being killed or captured. In contrast, American pilots survived long enough to master their craft, honing instincts, perfecting tactics, and turning experience into dominance, all because their machines could go farther. The concept was so deceptively simple that even the engineers who had rejected it came to see its beauty. Fuel equaled range, range equaled freedom, and freedom in the air meant everything. While generals argued strategy in ornate map rooms, in hangars like Kelsey's, the lessons of innovation had taken root. Do not wait for permission to solve a problem. Build, test, prove. The hierarchy of war had no time for perfection, only results mattered. Kelsey's crude tanks were proof that courage and creativity could save more lives than any theoretical design. General Ira Eaker would later say that the mechanic's invention had bought America the luxury of precision. With long-range escorts, the bombers no longer scattered. They hit their marks and came home together. Strategy itself became more daring because it could now afford to be. The final push toward Berlin came in the spring of 1945. The capital burned day and night under relentless raids. Bombers leveled the rail centers, communications hubs, and industrial plants that fed the Nazi war machine. The skies above the city, once ruled by Messerschmitts, now echoed with the steady growl of Mustangs. Every one of them carried those unmistakable tear-shaped tanks until moments before battle. The German people looked up and saw inevitability written in vapor trails. Even Hermann Goering, watching from his command post, admitted in despair, "If the Americans can fly their fighters to Berlin, we have lost the war." By the time Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, the outcome had long been decided in the air. American bombers had delivered more than 400,000 tons of bombs on German targets in the final year alone. The external fuel tank was an invisible partner in every sortie. It had turned the limited into limitless, the vulnerable into victorious. In the months after victory, as Europe rebuilt from the ruins, the Army Air Forces conducted a series of post-war analyses. Historians, scientists, and commanders gathered data, searching for the pivotal technologies that had decided the conflict. Radar, the Norden bomb sight, the proximity fuse, all were recognized. But one unassuming line item, buried deep in the reports, carried disproportionate weight. Auxiliary external fuel tank, single-use, fighter class, deployed December 1943. That simple entry represented the hinge upon which the air war had turned. The findings were unanimous. Without external tanks, strategic bombing would have remained limited to Western Germany. The Luftwaffe would have preserved its strength, and the invasion of Europe might have cost tens of thousands more Allied lives. The tank was not a weapon of destruction, but of connection. It bridged distance, linked safety to risk, and turned the dream of total air superiority into reality. Back in the United States, Benjamin Kelsey returned quietly to civilian life. He declined offers from aircraft manufacturers and military contractors. He settled in Ohio, opened a small repair garage, and spent the rest of his days fixing cars instead of planes. To his customers, he was just Ben the mechanic, a man who never charged more than he needed to and always kept a pot of coffee brewing. Only a few knew that the quiet man under the hood had once changed the course of a global war. Years later, when asked why he never pursued fame or fortune, Kelsey gave the same answer he had always given. "I was doing my job," he said. "I saw something broken and tried to fix it." That humility became the soul of his legacy. Modern historians now teach his story not just as a tale of military ingenuity, but as a case study in the psychology of innovation. How a lack of credentials can be a gift. How sometimes the outsider sees the path the experts overlook. The external fuel tank was not a triumph of engineering. It was a triumph of perspective. At aviation museums across America, visitors walk beneath gleaming Mustangs suspended from the ceiling, the sunlight glinting off the polished aluminum skins. Most eyes are drawn to the sharp nose, the elegant wings, the roaring engine that symbolized power. But the real story hangs lower, beneath the wings, those modest, streamlined tanks that look almost ornamental. Few realize that those simple shapes were once dismissed as impossible. Fewer still understand that without them, those planes might never have made it home. The truth is timeless. Every era faces its own impossible problems. Every generation needs its Kelsey, the mechanic, the outsider, the one willing to ask, "What if we just try?" Because history moves forward not by permission, but by persistence. So if stories like this stir something in you, if you find inspiration in the courage of ordinary people who dared to build extraordinary things, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We bring you more untold stories like this every week, exploring how small ideas change the world in the biggest ways. Join the journey. Learn from the innovators, dreamers, and doers who turned the word impossible into the next chapter of history. Hit subscribe and keep the spirit of invention alive. May 7th, 1945. The final day of war in Europe. Dawn light spills across the tarmac at Debden Airfield, painting the rows of P-51 Mustangs in gold. The smell of fuel, oil, and victory lingers in the cold morning air. Captain Don Gentile runs his hand along the curve of a wing, feeling the rivets beneath his fingertips. Two familiar shapes hang beneath the wings, gleaming in the sunlight, 150-gallon external tanks. Once symbols of desperate hope, they are now standard equipment, as ordinary as a landing gear check. Nobody talks about them anymore, nobody has to. They've done their job. Gentile climbs into the cockpit for what will be his final mission. The target is Prague, one last strike to ensure the end comes swiftly. The Mustang leaps from the runway, engine singing its steady, confident note. Above the clouds, Gentile thinks about the years behind him, the fear of Schweinfurt, the disbelief over Frankfurt, the impossible mission to Berlin. He remembers watching his fuel gauge tremble at empty and realizing he still had enough to make it home. He remembers the mechanic who made that possible. Benjamin Kelsey, a name barely known beyond the hangars, a man who asked a forbidden question and changed the balance of power. Over Prague, the bombs fall clean and true. The Luftwaffe offers no resistance. The skies that once burned with chaos are silent now. Gentile circles once, a solitary figure in a sky that no longer belongs to the enemy, and turns for home. As his plane levels out for the final time, he glances at the tanks beneath his wings and smiles. The crude idea that had once seemed insane now feels inevitable. Simple. Right. Sometimes the greatest innovations are the ones that seem obvious in hindsight. When he lands, the ground crew is waiting, not to celebrate, but to exhale. The war in Europe is over. Gentile steps down from his Mustang and places a hand on one of the tanks, still warm from flight. "You got me home," he murmurs. Around him, laughter erupts, relief rippling through the field like a breeze. Mechanics, pilots, officers, they all know what those tanks meant. They had turned fear into certainty, limitation into strength. The official history books would record the external tank as a technical upgrade. Engineers would file it under logistics and range extension, but the pilots knew it was more than that. It was faith made metal, a promise that they could always come back. Every raid that reached farther, every bomber that dropped its payload and survived, every man who walked away from his 20th, 30th, or 35th mission owed something to that impossible idea. Kelsey never saw himself as a hero. After the war, he returned home quietly, buying a small house and setting up a workshop behind it. He fixed cars, tractors, even lawnmowers, anything with an engine. Neighbors would bring broken machines to his garage and watch him work, hands steady, eyes thoughtful, sparks flashing under the welder's glow. Few knew that those same hands had once built the most important piece of hardware of the air war. When asked by a curious reporter decades later what drove him to do it, he chuckled. "I wasn't trying to make history," he said. "I was trying to stop watching kids die." History, however, had already made its judgment. Generals wrote that Kelsey's tanks shortened the war by months. Historians called it one of the most significant battlefield innovations of the 20th century. In museums across America, Mustangs hang suspended with their tanks restored, silver shells reflecting the overhead lights. Visitors stare up in awe at the sleek fuselage, the elegant lines, the painted nose art, but the veterans who walk through those halls know where to look. They look at the wings, at the teardrop tanks beneath them, and they nod. Innovation doesn't always look heroic. It doesn't always roar or shine. Sometimes it sits quietly beneath the wing, carrying the weight that makes all the glory possible. That is the real story of Benjamin Kelsey and the impossible trick that made bombers twice as deadly, fighters twice as brave, and victory twice as close. The legacy went far beyond the war. The same principle, extending range to extend reach, became the backbone of modern aviation. Jet fighters adopted external tanks as standard. Aerial refueling was developed directly from the idea Kelsey proved possible. Today, every long-range mission, every fighter sortie across continents carries his influence. Each drogue hose extending from a tanker aircraft is, in spirit, a descendant of those first crude aluminum cans welded together on a cold English night. Gentile's last words about the invention still echo in interviews and archives. "They weren't pretty," he said, "but they worked. And in war, working is all that matters." That line could have been Kelsey's motto. It remains a truth as relevant in peace as in battle. Progress doesn't wait for perfection. It waits for someone brave enough to start. Look around at any breakthrough today, technology, medicine, space travel, and you'll find traces of that same thinking. Somebody, somewhere ignored the word impossible. Somebody picked up a torch, a wrench, or a keyboard and said, "Let's just try." That's how change happens. That's how history turns. So when you hear a story like this, remember it isn't just about airplanes or war. It's about the stubborn spark in people who refuse to stop imagining. It's about the idea that brilliance can come from anywhere, from a mechanic, from a dreamer, from someone who doesn't know they're not supposed to win. That's why we tell these stories, to keep that spark alive, to remind you that the next great leap forward might come from a workshop, a garage, or a mind that won't sit still. If stories like this ignite something in you, if you believe that ingenuity can rewrite destiny, then join us. Subscribe to our channel and become part of the community that celebrates the thinkers, the tinkerers, the rebels who refuse to take no for an answer. Every week we uncover another hidden chapter of history, another impossible that became real. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and keep your imagination fueled. Because as Benjamin Kelsey proved, one small idea can change everything, even the course of a war.